Hey guys, Coach Goodrich here with another 8th grade American history video. This is the second part of Unit 6, Part 2, which is dealing specifically with the Civil War. So it's a lot of information again. I'm going to be kind of going quickly through it so I can fit this all into one video. But you have your notes and you have this video which you can watch as many times as you want. So here we go. Civil War, the war between the states. So after Lincoln wins the presidential election of 1860, Southern states vote to secede from the Union in this order: South Carolina, then Mississippi, then Florida, then Alabama, then Georgia, Louisiana, Texas, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and then North Carolina. These states would unite to form the Confederate States of America, also known as the Confederacy, the CSA, or just the South. Jefferson Davis, pictured here, kind of looks like Abraham Lincoln actually, former senator from Mississippi, is elected as president. Montgomery, Alabama was chosen as the first capital city for the Confederacy. Richmond, Virginia was the longest lasting capital, and Danville, Virginia, not that far away from Richmond, was the final capital. Secession was finalized by the time Lincoln formally took office in March of 1861. So, the Mason-Dixon line, roughly here, is the unofficial boundary between the North and the South. There we go. If you notice, some of these states, Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia would pop up later, never broke away from the Union, but they did keep their states, and Maryland as well. These are going to be known as the border states, but they're going to stay allied with the Union forces. West Virginia doesn't become a state until a little bit later on. Fort Sumter. April 12, 1861, around 4:30 a.m., the first shots of the war were fired by Confederate ships and cannon in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. Fort Sumter was shelled for 34 consecutive hours. There were no human casualties on either side. In fact, the only casualty was a horse that got scared and stepped off the ledge of the fort when a cannon went off next to it. Fort Sumter surrendered to the CSA, a bloodless beginning to the bloodiest conflict in American history. 4 years later, almost to the day, when the war is over, 700,000 Americans would die as a result of this war. And there's Fort Sumter today. I want to look way back then. So let's do an overview of the Civil War. So we have causes: slavery, economics, and sectionalism. Slavery, abolition versus enslavement. Economics, commercial or industrial versus agricultural. North is 90% of the industry, which is the future. South is 10% of the industry and 90% of the agriculture, which is kind of like past stuff. Still important, but not as important. And then you got sectionalism. You got congressional acts, the expansion of slavery, what does that look like? And of course, states' rights. So all of those would lead up eventually to the war. We've been building for a long time. Resources for the North, the Union or USA, well-established central governments. You have a higher population, more resources. You got manufactured goods, so you're able to make weapons and ammunition and food and supplies a lot easier. And they had conscription, fancy word for the draft. For the South, Confederacy for the CSA, the war is going to be fought primarily in the South, so in their homeland. Superior military leadership, more experienced military leadership, and they would also use the draft strategies. The Northern Plan at the beginning of the war, created by General Winfield Scott, was called the Anaconda Plan. It involved these three components: naval blockade of southern coast, so they could not receive aid from any foreign countries. They would seize control of the Mississippi River, cut the South in half, so you have the western South, which would be like Texas and Louisiana beyond that, and the eastern half. And then capture Richmond, the capital. This would lead to the total war implemented by Generals Grant and Sherman. We'll talk more about that later on. The Southern Plan was a defensive war. They knew they couldn't win a straight-up fight, kind of like the American rebels in the American Revolution. Capture Washington, D.C., not that far. You're going to have smaller raiding parties, guerrilla warfare, and what they wanted to do was just repel the numerous northern invasions, outlast the enemy, make the North want to stop fighting, just want to give up, that it's not worth you losing that many men or resources to win. And eventually, they thought the North would quit, and they came close. The leaders of the Army. By the end of the war, for the Union, you can have Ulysses S. Grant. For the Confederacy, you can have Robert E. Lee. Yes, the guy they called John Brown, the abolitionist. Lincoln's going to go through several top generals, but it always came back to Grant, who embraced the idea of total war, literally destroying everything that could be of use to the enemy, whether that would be houses, food supplies, ammunition, railroads, enemy troops as well, sometimes civilians. Whatever he thought could break the spirit of the enemy, he attacked. He was a master of troop and management, logistics, how to move people and supplies, because you can't have hungry men or men without ammunition fighting very well for very long. He understood that the North had more men and supplies, and that he should not be afraid to use them. Robert E. Lee is generally considered one of the brightest military minds in history, and was approached by Lincoln to lead the Union forces at the beginning of the war. A native Virginian, he could not bring himself to fight against his own family. He then accepted the CSA command and fought his way into legend. He's still remembered fondly by people on both sides as a true gentleman. Major battles of the Civil War. All right, here we go. Let's see how much time we got left. Let's see if we got a prayer getting through this. Okay. Here we go. First and Second Bull Run, also known as First and Second Manassas in Virginia, July 21st, 1861, and August 28th through 30th, 1862. The July one was the first major engagement in the war. Spectators from both sides gathered on hillsides to watch. This proved that this would not be a quick and easy war, but it was a major Confederate victory, both of them. This is 30 miles from D.C., so it really scared the heck out of the Union forces. Yeah. This is what it looks like today. And that, in the background, is Wilmer McLean's house. He's got an interesting story that we'll talk about later, but this is his house in Manassas, which was used as a field hospital for wounded soldiers on both sides during the war. He was so terrified of what he saw that he would sell this house and move to a place called Appomattox. We'll talk about that later. Some more major battles. Battle of Shiloh, April 6th through 7th, 1862, the first major fighting on the Western Front. West is in Tennessee. Albert Sidney Johnston for the South versus U.S. Grant for the North. Despite the heavy casualties, Grant pushes the Confederates back towards Mississippi and continues his invasion of the West. Grant gains fame as a winner, also known among his men as a butcher for the number of troops that he sacrificed, and showcases the ideas of total war, which would become very popular towards the end. The Battle of Antietam, Sharpsburg, September 17th, 1862. This is the single bloodiest day of conflict in American history, with 25,000 combined casualties in one 24-hour period. Robert E. Lee versus George McClellan. McClellan technically wins, but he fails to follow after Lee's army, where he could have finished the war early. Lincoln takes this opportunity to deliver the Emancipation Proclamation 5 days later, which frees all the slaves in the South. However, just because he had that, technically, they have no power to enforce it until they win the war. So, kind of meaningless until that happens. This is known as the Sunken Road, where a lot of people from both sides trying to cross over this no man's land get caught up in the crossfire. Battle of Vicksburg, May 18th through July 4th, 1863, the final major battle of the Western Campaign in Mississippi. John C. Pemberton for the South versus U.S. Grant for the North. After having two frontal assaults pushed back, Grant surrounds the city for a month-long siege to starve them out. The city surrenders on July 4th, and now the Union has control of the Mississippi River and the shipping industry there, cutting the South in half, which was one of the plans from the outset of the war. Battle of Gettysburg, the watershed moment, the most important battle, is July 1st through 3rd, 1863, same time period as the Battle of Vicksburg. This is the last Confederate invasion into Northern Territory. Robert E. Lee versus George Meade. You have 180,000 combined soldiers. Lee's forces trying to invade the D.C. area were pushed back numerous times, losing about a third of their strength. You got 51,000 casualties in 3 days. And casualties is killed, wounded, missing in action. The bloodiest battle in American history over those 3 days. 4 months later, Lincoln gives a speech that dedicated the battlefield, which would now become known as the Gettysburg Address. You see Lincoln there, with all arrows pointing. Sherman's march to the city, May through December 1864. The final stages of the war begin with Grant taking command of the whole Union Army. His top general, William Tecumseh Sherman, is given 60,000 soldiers to invade the railroad city of Atlanta and destroy Confederate towns and supplies on the way to Savannah, the last major port in the South. Meeting minimal resistance along the way, Sherman's forces burn Atlanta to the ground, turn railroads into Sherman's neckties, and destroy farms, homes, etc. in a mile-wide swath as they march to the coast, demonstrating the best example in American history of total war. Savannah was surrendered to Sherman on December 21st, 1864, and he sent a telegram to Lincoln saying, "Merry Christmas, Mr. Lincoln, I present to you the city of Savannah." They would heat up the railroad spikes and they would bend them around each other and twist them so that no one could use them. Like so. Battles of Petersburg and Richmond, July 1864 to April 1865, the last major confrontations of the war on the main front. Robert E. Lee versus U.S. Grant. Grant pushes a retreating Lee back towards the Confederate capital of Richmond. A number of small, inconclusive battles were fought around the area, forcing Grant to build numerous trenches to surround the Confederates, kind of like what he did at Vicksburg. Before being totally surrounded, Lee and his army retreats, abandoning Petersburg and setting fire to Richmond to prevent the Union from gathering supplies. That's what Richmond looked like afterwards, and this is actually the same building, just like turned into like a little mini concert hall, which I think is really cool. The end of the war. Appomattox Courthouse, April 9th, 1865. Resulted in the final Confederate surrender. Once again, Lee versus Grant. After a small skirmish, Lee realizes that the cause is lost. He and the other Confederate leaders meet up with Grant and Union officials to formally surrender, which ends the Civil War. And after taking an oath of loyalty to the Union, Confederate soldiers could leave in peace for their horses and mules and sidearms. And just like that, almost 4 years exactly to the day. They signed the treaty in Wilmer McLean's house in Appomattox, the same guy whose house they used as a field hospital for the Battle of Manassas. He sold his house, bought a new one in Appomattox. They signed in his front parlor. They say the war started in his backyard and ended in his dining room. Aftermath of the Civil War. Ooh, we're close. We're going to have to go quick, though. All right. 185,000 African Americans fought for the Union by the time the war was over. Clara Barton, a nurse under the American Red Cross, served as a nurse throughout the war. You can see the first examples of modern warfare, ironclad ships like the Monitor and the Merrimack, trenches, telegraphs, but a distinct lack of medical technology. A lot of people died from sickness and disease and wounds as well as just being killed. Lincoln wins the election of 1864, ran against his former general, George McLean. Andrew Johnson was Lincoln's vice president. Grant emerges as a national hero in the North and a villain in the South for his ways of fighting the war. Jefferson Davis, president of the Confederacy, was captured in Georgia on May 10, 1865, captured dressed as a woman, according to legend, trying to escape. And then, like we said earlier, 700,000 total dead from the war, soldiers from both sides, the deadliest war in American history. This is the Massachusetts 54th Regiment charging one of the forts, Fort Wagner in South Carolina. Red Cross. Monitor and the Merrimack fighting against each other, some trenches. And I just think these photos are cool. Like that in colors, like almost like a live video. However, all is not well. On April 14th, 1865, Good Friday, a couple days before Easter, Lincoln and his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, attend the play at Ford's Theater in D.C., accompanied by Major Rathbun and his wife, originally meant to go with U.S. Grant, but Grant said he wanted to go visit his family in New Jersey. John Wilkes Booth, an actor and a spy for the Confederacy, shot Lincoln in the back of the head with a Derringer pistol, stabbed Rathbun, leapt from the balcony, breaking his leg on the stage, shouted "Sic Semper Tyrannis, thus be to tyrants," and escaped. Attempts were also made on the lives of the Secretary of State, William Seward, and Vice President Johnson. Booth would be caught a few weeks later and shot. Other conspirators would be executed. Lincoln would never wake up and would die on the morning of April 15th. Mini quiz 2. All right, guys. Go ahead and answer these questions on your packet and on Google Classroom for your grade, and I look forward to discussing this with you guys very, very soon. Good work.